Thank you. Now, Jim Plummer.
Very difficult to be in this seat and take off after the Jerry Wiesner comment. Walt Levison and I, as two engineer-manager types that are on this panel, representing the industrial group, quote, responsible for the development of the entire Corona program. It's totally obvious, I'm sure, to everybody in the audience that no single individual did this system. It was a team effort in industry working with the government. That's very, very clear. But before proceeding with a couple of comments I have, trying not to be redundant to things that you've already seen, I want to go back to Lou Allen's very, very good recital of the early days leading up to the WS-117L program. The original Air Force activity on that was the issuance of an RFP to industry under the title Pied Piper. And the Pied Piper was the thing that was going to be set up to use the satellite capability to do various types of things military things in orbit. I was fortunate to be at Lockheed at the time and have the opportunity to join the small group of people working on the final draft of the Lockheed proposal on that. We had teammates in those days, as you do in the big contest today. Our proposal was, by modern standards, not very thick, not very detailed, but at least we won the proposal. And that was the beginning of the creation of a space group in Lockheed. There were two individuals that, to my mind, deserve a tremendous amount of credit, and I will not try to name too many names because it would be, first, impossible, and second, unfair to the ones that I might omit if I tried to go too far. But the two individuals that I give extreme credit to the original Lockheed work in this were Willis Hawkins, who was at the time the vice president in charge of space, and Fred Green, who was the man that was brought in to be the driving, essentially, program manager of the Pied Piper, quote, now WS-117L program. But this was in 1956, I think you said, Lou, did you? And we did get started. It was kind of a stop-and-go situation because there was a great deal of concern throughout the entire system as to what was really to be done, could it be done, how much was it going to cost, what kind of a schedule were we going to have, and where would the funding come from. So it was a lot of the typical thing of plan and replan, refund and refund, and not much physical progress. But in the meantime, the small group of engineers working in these small division at Lockheed, at that time in Palo Alto, in one of the research labs, did design a vehicle. The vehicle looked very, very similar to the one that you've seen on the screen, and it was later to be called the Agena. But there was work accomplished. We had a mock-up that you could go look at. We had good work with the Bell Hustler engine. We had pretty much figured out all of the basic technical factors of a readout system-based satellite reconnaissance system. We'd never done any of it, but we had pretty much figured out what was to be done. And here's where I give credit to Will Green and Hawkins. Well, we were making fairly good progress until the Sputnik went off. And when the Sputnik was announced to the public, as General Allen said, all of a sudden it became a big issue in the Air Force and in the country, and we were given essentially totally funded responsibility to go do it and do it as fast as we could. And more progress was made. So in 1958, when we were, at that time I was responsible for the payload end of the program, and 1958 I got a big surprise. I was summoned to my boss's office and they said, Jim, are you willing to take on a new job? And I said, well, I was kind of disappointed because I liked the one I was on, but I said, sure. And he says, well, we want you to go underground. And I didn't know what underground meant really, but said, we want you to head up a totally covert program. We want you to disappear from Lockheed to all your friends, not tell anyone where you're going, and go off, take these 3 or 4 drawings that they handed me and said, go off and build that thing. Well, really, yeah, build it thing. And what this was, very interesting to me, was a design that had come out of some of the original work at RAND by 2 individuals known as Katz and Davies, Ameren Katz and Merton Davies. And what it was essentially a large football with a camera in the middle, which was based on a Fairchild camera that did exist, I guess, a retro rocket in the back, and a sphere taken from the Atlas ICBM instrumentation capsule, and that was built by GE. Well, we started out, I had to just disappear. I had no people and no place to work. So I went out and I rented a motel up on the El Camino Avenue and started to look over these drawings and really wonder what was going to happen. But given authority by my superiors, we then went out and found a very, very handy factory referred to by General Allen as the Hiller facility. Well, Hiller was building helicopters in those days pretty well and had built himself a research and development hangar where he was working on ramjet thrust helicopters, and it wasn't very successful. So he was willing to rent that facility to us. It had a hangar, it had offices, telephones, things that we needed. So we took that over, only to tell Hiller, from now on you can't enter the building. It was totally closed, and nobody, very, very few people in Lockheed knew that we were living in or doing our work in Hiller. They even said, take a circuitous route from home each day so people can't track you as to where you're going in the morning. Well, anyhow, we worked on that design for some time and could see that maybe it could be done. It was a high-risk system, and I won't describe it in any more detail than I have. When all of a sudden we were confronted by the top leaders, General Ritland, Mr. Bissell, Mr. B as we called him, and told that we're going to drop that, and as a result of the work that Dr. Garwin did, told you we're going on a new route. And this was kind of refreshing, but certainly a shock to us in the system. At that time, they handed us this work statement that has been referred to, and I have it here. It's a page and a half of written material together with a schedule. And that was the basis of the program. And all it said was, it's going to be a satellite. It's going to be based on WS-117L as much as you can. Make it compatible with an overt biomedical payload for cover. Photographs should be obtained at 25 feet or better. Maximum ground coverage that you can get. Latent image film with recovery, of course, was the big new move. And then finally, recover this thing within a plus or minus 200 nautical mile in north-south distance and plus or minus 75 miles in cross distance. That was all there was to it. Then they attached a schedule. They did specify that we would use ITEC and General Electric as the two basic subcontractors to us as the prime. But the design release was to be accomplished in 2 months. The prototype was to be accomplished 2 months later. The first flight units were to be delivered 10 months from the starting date. And the first flight schedule was 11 months from the starting date. Well, if we had not had the wonderful team that I was fortunate to work with in Lockheed, and then the strong teams that we had in ITEC and General Electric, and many others, I must say. There were many other subcontractors that were important in the WS-117L, and they were all present. So it was a very, very large group of people. Only a select few were briefed on Corona. And that made it a little bit difficult for us working in Corona because we had to get things done without telling them what we were doing, and sometimes without authority. Sometimes we'd have to go to a real smart physicist or a dynamicist or something and say, do this for me, but we won't tell you why we want it. It was difficult from that point of view. And of course the obvious thing too is that all of these people that I have mentioned and have referred to are mostly the managers. They're engineers, but they're also managers. The real work was done by the shop people, the technicians, the detailed design engineers, and so forth. So if a person were to say, who's responsible for the Corona, I'd have to say it's measured in the thousands of people. Very, very clear. As the movie showed, there were a lot of failures. But sounding exactly like the prime contractor that I was, we looked at them as a bunch of engineering successes, and I really do mean that, because there was an engineering achievement to every one of those. There was an achievement even in the failures, because we learned to diagnose problems that never could have been done before, because this was the first time that a long-lasting vehicle of any kind had to work perfectly without any person there to bring it back home and check it out like an airplane. And we had very, very few things in the way of long-range screwdrivers like they have today, where they can tweak things up and improve things. So it's very, very difficult from that point of view. Some of the failures that we had led to some very, very neat, clean analysis. And it was difficult for us to take these analyses to our primary customers that I've mentioned, John Parangosky and Lee Battle being the two primary CIA and Air Force contact, but to take them to the higher levels in Washington. Dr. Cherrick, who was at the time the director of the National Reconnaissance Office, and our primary reporting point. So after a minor engineering success or a very miserable failure, we had to go back to Dr. Cherrick and explain it to him. And he was very, very patient listening to us. Luckily for us, he's a very strong technical person himself, so he could stay with us. Mr. Bissell, of course, was true all the way through. So that worked very well. And we went through all of those failure analyses and did end up with the successes that you've seen in the movie. There was one other aspect of the managing the program of this type that I want to mention to you, and that is the security. I said covert. When they said covert in those days, they really meant covert. You couldn't talk to anybody. It was need to know, very strict, real need to know. But at the same time, Lee Battle and I particularly had to face some people in the outside world. For example, when we were launching the mice in the early days as cover story, the Air Force agreed to have a press conference. Well, these smart reporters would come into the room and start asking questions which we couldn't answer. And it's hard to stonewall a smart reporter, because they want to bore in on something because they suspect we're doing more than we said. Another situation we had that was difficult, and I'm sure it happened in the other contractors too, was we were doing these jobs in total secrecy, and then some of our other smart engineers would come and knock on your door and say, I want to talk to you about an idea I have. And what they would do is reveal their own private design of something that might be done in orbit, such as recovered film from orbit. And then you had to turn them off by saying, well, it's a pretty good idea, but we haven't got time for that, or some other way to get them out of your office. And then the final thing in the security that was difficult was in this process of going to the Pentagon to report to Dr. Cherrick and to the people up at CIA, we generally would go around and see others in the Pentagon that knew we were doing something, and these were generally pretty high-ranking officers. And this was very difficult because it's hard to lie to a high-ranking officer. General LeMay was a good example. He was very, very difficult. And then others that knew something was going on and thought that the explanations put out by this colonel and this engineer from Lockheed were very bad answers to the questions. And that led to great problems. But it was a great thing, a great challenge, a tremendous pleasure to work with many of you here in this audience, because a big part of the principal people in the industrial part are here today. And it was a great pleasure for me all the time to be associated with this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Levison, ITEC.
Well, this is truly an unexpected pleasure. I never got to see one of these launches because Jim Plummer would never let me go down there for security reasons. He was afraid someone would recognize me. Anyway, I'd like to tell you a little bit of the history of panoramic cameras. They've been around for a long, long time, but they were never thought of as an aerial camera until Dick Philbrick, who at the time was the Air Force liaison officer at the Boston University Physical Research Laboratory, modified a strip camera and put it into an airplane. And it rotated around the longitudinal axis of the aircraft, and the film moved synchronously with the rotation of the camera. You would never believe it. It was probably built in about 2 days, but as usual, the things that you build fast tend to work. If a very dramatic photograph of Manhattan from an altitude of 10,000 feet caused quite a stir, because you could see the island very, very beautifully, and there was Central Park, and it all faded off into the horizon like panoramic photography usually does. You could ask the question of why panoramic photography. It's very difficult to get wide-angle coverage from a lens and still get high resolution. In a panoramic camera, you just have to cover a very, very narrow angle. And you sweep the rest of the picture, you sweep mechanically. And this was a thought that we had when we got a contract on 461L, which was a balloon camera. And it was part of the Genetrix program. And we built a 12-inch f5 camera, very, very lightweight lens, very, very lightweight camera. It didn't even have paint on it. We were saving every ounce we could. And that camera was what we call a direct scanning panoramic camera. It was just like the cameras that they built in the 19th century for taking pictures of long lines of people. And you've all seen that, where the same individual is on the left side and the right side. He ran across behind this line of people while the camera was panning it. This is a very simple concept, a very simple camera. And that was the one that we flew in a balloon. And Amram Katz and Mert Davies dubbed that HIAC for high acuity. In this balloon system, it was designed to be flown at 100,000 feet. And of course, it still had to be extremely lightweight because the balloon does not carry a lot of weight. And we had to put a lot of water on board the balloon to stabilize the temperature for night and day. But a balloon is a lovely, quiet, slow-moving platform. And for the first time in history, an aerial camera consistently produced 100 lines per millimeter. And Katz was so impressed by that he actually wrote me a letter, and I still am proud that I had that letter, because he said he has never seen aerial photography of this kind, and this is a new era of aerial photography. Just to give you a feel for what this means, if you were to enlarge that photograph 20 times, you start out with a negative that's 2 inches wide by 25 inches long. You enlarge it 20 times, it turns out to be 3 feet wide by 42 feet long. And you can look at that from one end to the other end, and it would appear sharp to the unaided eye. That was incredible quality when you consider that up until that time, World War II photography did maybe 10 lines per millimeter, maybe 15 lines per millimeter at the most. There were 40 of those cameras made. 3 of them were deployed operationally, and we never saw the results of any one of them. The Russians did. We have one of these cameras on display at the Smithsonian Museum now. I suspect that the Corona camera will join it very shortly, if it's not there already. ITEC Corporation was formed in 1957, the fall of 1957, by Dick Leghorn. And about 3 months later, January 1st, he acquired the laboratories at Boston University. Leghorn had long been an advocate of pre-hostilities reconnaissance, and he was a major contributor to the Open Skies proposal that President Eisenhower introduced at the Geneva Summit of 1955. Khrushchev chose to characterize Open Skies as another U.S. attempt at espionage, which, of course, we all know was not true. But the notion that aerial reconnaissance could be, as it eventually was, used to promote peace and verify disarmament was one that interested me deeply in the coming years. But we had a contract at ITEC to build part of the data processing equipment for 117L. And we were aware of the camera. It was a spin-stabilized 6-inch focal-length panoramic camera. Very much like the camera that Philbrick had originally modified and flown over Manhattan. We knew, of course, about the balloon camera, having designed it, knew what its potential was. And so we proposed, on an unsolicited basis, a 24-inch f5 PetStar camera, and narrowed the scan angle down to 70 degrees. We thought we could probably get 20 to 25-foot ground resolution from satellite altitudes, and fortunately, that proved to be correct. The project office funded both projects for a very short time, but inside of a month, probably due to the influence of land, I would guess, switched over to the longer focal length camera, and we became the prime contractor for that. Fairchild, however, continued to manufacture the camera. We made the lenses, and it got off the ground. It got off to a very, very fast start, and all of the subsystems had their problems, as you see in the film. The camera was no exception. The most notable camera problem was film breakage, because that's a pretty hostile environment to acetate film. And the vacuum, degassed all of the solvents. The film became very, very brittle and had to be treated with the utmost gentle care if it was ever going to survive. It didn't, and the film broke in orbit constantly. And the launch schedule came to a grinding halt while we went into the environmental lab to see whether we could simulate the problem and do anything about it. And we did do something about it, but the camera never really worked successfully until Eastman Kodak came up with the polyester base, and that really put that particular problem to bed. You've heard about the first successful recovery of imagery. It took place a very short time after this program started. And incidentally, the air snatch recovery technique was another product, like the camera, of the Genetrex balloon program, because that's when that particular recovery system was designed. It was a different problem. When it came down from the balloon, it was not moving very fast. It was a very, very slow descent. When it comes down from the satellite, it's coming down at a heck of a pace. We were disappointed with the results of that first mission. It had about 35-foot ground resolution compared to the design objective of 20. But we were also very encouraged by it. The system had worked, and what's more, we knew that we could improve the program. We went through a series of improvements, and I've got them all written down here, and I'm not going to say them, because in the long run, what we wound up with were two cameras which I had to spend a little bit of time on. We changed the lens to a Petzval design lens. Now, a Petzval lens, interestingly enough, is a very old lens design, and it was used in portraiture. It's what we call a soft focus lens, and it suffers from extensive field curvature. But what we recognized, or what Hopkins recognized probably, Bob Hopkins of the University of Rochester designed the camera, was that that's not important in a panoramic camera, because you can take a very narrow angle, like 2 inches. 2 inches on 24 inches is a very narrow angle lens. And you can put a field flattener, a very lightweight cylindrical field flattener, in the focal plane, and you can get essentially diffraction limited resolution. So it was this ability to take an old style lens, the Petzval, and modify it with a field flattener and use it in the slit of a panoramic camera that made this high acuity resolution possible. And the resolving power jumped at that point. The lines per millimeter jumped to 180 to 200 lines per millimeter. And now if I could go back to that example I gave you on the 12-inch, this is now a 24-inch, and instead of 120 degrees of scan, it's now 70 degrees of scan. If you enlarged that image, which was about 30 inches long, 40 times, because that's what the resolution of this system would allow you to do, you now have a print that's 7 feet wide by 100 feet long, which is, if you can just imagine that, that's an incredible amount of information to have on one piece of paper. In fact, it's not usable, so they never used it that way. They used it the way you saw in the film. That is, you made a contact, transparent positive and used stereo microscopes to look at it. And they use even higher resolving power, higher magnifications than I just said, the 40 times magnification. The second major improvement was, as shown in the film, the mural camera system, which consisted of two of these cameras, the C triple prime, one pointing forward and one pointing backward at 15 degrees each, or giving a stereo angle of 30 degrees. And from that, you can get a stereo model, and the interpreters could now in addition to being able to make measurements in X and Y, could also make measurements in Z, get height information out of it. A final modification of the Corona camera was a constant rotator. We still had a intermittent back and forth movement of a scan arm and slit. So we had this very high resolution, heavy lens that's rotating around, and then we'd scan over and take the picture, and it would return on the backstroke. What we did was because the vehicle at this point could stand additional diameter, which is what we needed, and we put another drum on so that now the slit rotated constantly as well as the lens rotating constantly, and new film was moved into place, and you had, again, stereo coverage. That was called the J3. It was the last of the Corona series, and it was an extraordinarily successful and extraordinarily reliable system, because I think you'll see that the statistics show that about this point in the growth of the Corona system, we have a highly reliable camera system, a highly reliable vehicle, a highly reliable re-entry. And I think the ultimate side of this is that we went to two buckets. And first you would expose film, and this gave you an incredible amount of flexibility. First you would expose a bunch of film, I think it was about 80 pounds at this time, and load it into one bucket, and then you could stop the camera, you could re-enter the first bucket, you can wait and restart the camera, or you can have continuous coverage. You had immense flexibility in your programming on orbit. I've not talked at all about the photogrammetric aspects of the Corona system. From the very beginning, we knew that panoramic cameras, although rich in intelligence, had distortions that made it very hard to use for precise measurement. And in fact, my good friend Amram Katz used to say that photogrammetry had to do with the character of the terrain, and intelligence had to do with the characters on the terrain. We were fortunate enough in ITEC to have a very small but excellent photogrammetric group, first under Klaus Aschenbrenner and then under Ron Ondraker. Aschenbrenner is no longer with us, but Ondraker is in this room. And throughout this entire program, they were very helpful in getting things like horizon cameras in, Stella Index cameras in. And in addition to that, they developed some equipment to help in the photo interpretation. There was a piece of equipment called a gamma rectifier, which was almost as big as a stage, which produced a very large, near-vertical, map-like reproduction of the terrain from this panoramic photography. And it was extremely flexible in that it could compensate for earth curvature, stereo angle, image motion compensation, pitch and roll of the spacecraft, etc. In addition to that, they built a very large rear projection photo-interpretation viewer. There's one problem that I have to talk about, and that is the one that was mentioned before, which is corona. From the very beginning, we had evidence of static electrical discharge. Sometimes it was dendritic tree-like patterns, sometimes it was bands of increased density. But we always had corona. Purcell, we went down to see Ed Purcell at Harvard, who was on the ITEC Science Advisory Board, and he was a member of the Land Committee and discussed this problem with him. And he made several suggestions, and we tried them all. In the long run, the only thing that worked was we did make the roller, the metering roller in particular, out of conducting rubber, and that didn't consistently work. So what we took to doing was we put them in a steam bath, and then we actually installed them into a test rig and a camera, put it into an environmental test chamber, and we chose the good ones and threw out the bad ones. And that's the way that problem eventually got resolved.
1 minute.
Okay. Well, there are many people at ITEC who contributed to the success of this camera, and some of them are in this room today, but I would be unfortunate if I didn't at least mention two names. One of them is John Wolf, who you saw in the film. He was the project manager of most of the Corona program. And the second one was Frank Madden, who was the chief engineer on the camera, from the very early days of the balloon photography right through to the final design J3. And his calm guidance, his penetrating intellect, his pragmatic approach, and his ability to come up with solutions to problems that appeared to be intractable was uncanny. When I talked to him about this recently, he says that he thought the static corona problem was resolved by divine intervention. I know that it was his determination that eventually solved that problem. It was a great program. We worked very hard. We enjoyed being on it. And it would not have been possible without the kind of environment that Dick Bissell, Joe Charac, Jim Plummer, and the rest of that management staff provided for us. We all felt we were doing something important. We all felt they trusted us, and we all felt we were being amply rewarded for this job. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.